Welcome, and thank you for attending our special first election edition of our live Thursdays at noon community events. But first and most importantly, we acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples in the Williams and Huron-Robinson Treaties area. We recognize the long history of First Nations and Métis people on this land and show respect to them today. We acknowledge our neighbors, the Wata Mohawks and the First Nations of Moose Deer Point, Shawanaga, Wissahickon, Magnetawan, Henvey Inlet, Nipissing, and Doquis. We acknowledge that this day, May 5th, is the National Day of Awareness and Action for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Gender Diverse People. We're back during this provincial election to give the candidates seeking your vote in Parry Sound-Muskoka the opportunity to speak directly on the issues. Today, we have Green Party candidate Matt Richter. Hi, Matt, and welcome.
Thank you, merci, and miigwech, Pamela. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to be part of this panel and hearing more from the people of our riding, and it's just a wonderful opportunity.
Would you like to take a minute to introduce yourself?
I would, thank you. So hello, bonjour, and ani, and I like to say anishna, and how are you? Comment ça va? My name is Matt Richter, and I am a longtime resident here in our riding, and I'm so proud to be the returning candidate for Parry Sound-Muskoka, your candidate as the Ontario Green for the Ontario Green Party. You know, for over so many years, I've watched how the status quo has just led to more status quo, and that's simply not good enough. I realized that it is time to move beyond the same old way of thinking. As a teacher, a small business owner, and a father of three, we need to do better. We need to see what we can move forward with good public policy. And I'm ready as ever to fight for affordable housing that's affordable to live in, to ensure that we have a climate plan that actually brings real action to protect nature and restore our water, and to look at our healthcare system and say it's time finally to acknowledge that mental health is health and to incorporate our mental health services within OHIP and greater care. And you know, this time through, everyone, it is a time for change. And I've heard it across this riding over the past year. And with Norm Miller retiring, we're in a position now where we can really celebrate that Parry Sound-Muskoka can change from the old ways. And I'm proud to bring up that fight down to Queen's Park on your behalf and share a better way forward that really brings honesty and integrity back to Queen's Park. I am here to earn your vote, not buy your vote. We are ready to build trust and bridge relationships as a united front going down to Queen's Park. And I'm thrilled to be able to have this opportunity. And thank you, Pamela, and to everybody at Metroland Media to put forums on like this. As I say to everybody, it's about listening to people and hearing the solutions to the issues that we face. So thank you. And I'm, again, excited to be able to share and to listen and take questions later on.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt. To everyone who's joined us, thank you for joining us. Please do mute your microphone. I usually can do that myself, and it's not allowing me to. So please mute yourself. We'll have opportunity to ask questions later. First, we are going to go through 7 questions that we are posing to all of the candidates. And Matt, the first one, recognizing this day, how would your party advance the actions proposed by the Truth and Reconciliation Report and the actions in the MMIWG report?
You know, our party, and thank you, Pamela, for bringing this to the attention to the panel here and everyone listening in. Our party is so committed to bringing the Indigenous people back into the level of government that is so desperately needed. And when it comes to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we are specifically looking at the guidelines needed to ensure that we get guidance from the Indigenous communities across Ontario and right here in our riding. Starting with how we protect our nature and water, it can't be just listening in, it's actually incorporating and bringing the Indigenous people into the government to give the guidance as to how we proceed with protecting and expanding our protected nature and water spaces. It also includes how we get guidance going forward into our healthcare, in our mental health care, that we must bring in the wisdom of our Indigenous elders. And we put it right in the platform, it's right in our policy, that we must bring in to our healthcare system, into the Ministry of Health, permanent positions that shape the guidance as to future policy. And another piece here, as a teacher here in Huntsville, I'm really proud of the four specific calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation under the education component. And that's where we're saying it can't be just a checklist the way the other governments have used Indigenous curriculum as a one day, or just taking different areas of Indigenous curriculum and actually putting it to the side. Like, that's obviously problematic. Whereas we want to honor full positions within the Ministry of Ed that are literally promoted and provided input by consistent positions filled by those in the Indigenous community, whether it be a deputy education minister that's giving the guidance. That part of the equation moves forward with their input. It's so important that we acknowledge all of the different areas of the Truth and Reconciliation, and also being aware that it's moments like this that we have to be aware that we must be working across levels of government and pushing with our federal MP here in our riding and across, that the commitments that the federal government give must be followed through on. And we will do our part provincially, but we'll absolutely be a strong voice that where the federal government has a role, that we will be loud and clear showing commitment to that area as well.
Okay, thank you. It might be helpful if Matt's team's here, if you could put the platform in the chat so folks could check that. Next question, Matt.
Sorry, Pamela, did you ask if
Maureen could do it, put it in the chat.
They're just around right now, but if I could just lead anybody to mattrichter.ca, or simply you could also do gpo.ca. It might be easier before, I don't want to mess up the screen here on my part, but literally gpo.ca, if that could be put in the chat by anyone.
gpo.ca, there we go. Yep. It's there.
Or mattrichter.ca. No, thank you.
mattrichter.ca. Okay, folks, so you can find the platform there. So next question, Matt, how will you advocate for healthcare in Parry Sound-Muskoka?
Yeah, healthcare is such a key priority from one election to the next. And, since 2007, when I first ran, right through till now, building up the connections and relationships with people in our riding, it is so apparent the role that a healthy and dynamic healthcare system plays in our riding. I remember being back in Burk's Falls this was in 2008, when we literally lost one of our three hospitals that fell under Muskoka Algonquin Healthcare at the time. And that was massively problematic. We need to do better. And so moving forward, we know that when we have our two hospitals being positioned as a proposed promise, that we have to hold the government accountable to following through on bringing those two hospitals into the mix, one in Huntsville, one in Bracebridge. We're going to be the one voice holding the government to account that they follow through on that build. But it's also in our conversations with Muskoka Algonquin Healthcare that we recognize the number one issue here in our riding when it comes to healthcare is recruiting and retaining staff in our healthcare system. And that's why I'm proud to say that, the Ontario Green Party and myself, we were leading the charge to repeal Bill 124 and ensure literally ensure that we can afford and pay and with benefits and the pay that they deserve to our nurses and our personal support workers and healthcare staff in general. It is so important that we repeal Bill 124. But further to that point, we also have to recognize that we get Ontario back as a leader as to how we fund healthcare. Unfortunately, it's become very apparent that we have fallen here in Ontario to being the lowest per capita funded when it comes to healthcare funding. We are the lowest of all the provinces in Canada and territories. Like, that's shameful. We need to get Ontario back to being a leader as to how we fund healthcare. We also need to ensure that people recognize, which I'm sure most do, but at the government level, the government has to be pushed to recognize that mental health is health. And for far too long, this has been overlooked by the other governments. And we, back on March 4th, Mike Schreiner and I, down in Toronto, I'm proud to say that we released the first ever, literally the first ever standalone plan on mental health and addictions to the government. And it's calling for OHIP to be expanded to cover the mental health services we need, and also to declare the opioid overdose crisis is an actual public health emergency. These are the things that have been overlooked in the past. And, I'm proud on behalf of our riding to be that champion and fight for this needed approach down at Queen's Park for our healthcare needs.
Okay, Matt. So what grade would you give the province's COVID-19 response?
I remember being asked this recently, and as a teacher myself, when we look at grading, I do like to give credit where credit is due. And I would give it a C. And here's why. No one could have imagined what it would be like to navigate the COVID, the coronavirus, and how this was going to proceed through these past 2 years. It was all new. And so at the very beginning of the COVID-19 crisis and the pandemic that it was, we saw our government here in Ontario working across party lines, working across levels of government. It was so encouraging. But then after a few months, we saw the government go back to their old ways. And what resulted was chaotic decision-making. And what justifies the C, and I may even have to downgrade it to a C- or a D+ the further I get into this, was those non-budgetary items like clear communication, being transparent and open and honest with the public. Those were the failings of Ford and the Conservative government. People in the education system, people who work in the small business sector, people across our riding never really knew when things were opening or closing. Were students going to school? Were they being kept back in having to learn online? Was a restaurant allowed to open full or not? Were small businesses allowed to open, or was that just for big box stores? I heard time and time again, the only place to find out was on Twitter. And that's irresponsible, and that doesn't show real leadership. So for those reasons, and again, not to be negative for the sake of being negative, but I will deliver fair criticism when due, and I will acknowledge the benefits of those early actions for sure. But it was that miscommunication and that lack of trust that became very apparent that sent people into chaos during the last year and a half of this pandemic.
Okay, so what would your party do? COVID's not going away. What happens if we have a green government?
Yeah, so one thing that we've always championed is open and clear communication. And I think it's important to build trust and to look around the world as to where did the government play a role that built trust in the public and built a more proactive approach out of the pandemic and COVID-19. We can look at countries like New Zealand, Denmark. We can look across the world for good practices that made things happen in a way that people understood what was happening. They had the right and the opportunity to openly share information and be heard. And that's what we consistently saw. You know, having somebody like Doug Ford in government and saying to the people, the last place you want to trust money is with the government, is massively problematic. Now, that's a separate issue about money and spending, but it still sent the message that you can't trust the government. That's the opposite of leadership. That was just so irresponsible when he said that. We must develop trust. So one thing that we're committed to in the Green Party of Ontario, and I as your candidate, is being a fierce and strong champion of leadership and real leadership by being open and transparent, by holding weekly sessions and giving weekly updates online and in any form of media. Hopefully Metroland Media too will put in a weekly update that I can give. Just a little nudge there. But I want to reemphasize how critical it is that the key problem going through these past 2 years that I've heard time and time again from people across our riding was the lack of trust and the lack of open communication. Those are things that we need the political will and the political courage, which I believe, which I know I have, that I will absolutely deliver for our people and for the people of Ontario.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Next question. Cost of living, it's killing our readers. How would you manage the cost of living increases?
Yeah, again, and Pamela, and to everybody listening in and tuning in, as I have over the past few years just been crisscrossing this riding and connecting with people, it's been an ongoing problem that has been exacerbated with the pandemic, no doubt. But the cost of living is a number one issue here in our riding. And this is why we are so proud to push an affordable action plan that starts with when we look at our food, our transportation, our housing. But with our food, it is so important that we look at, again, best practices in the world, like a grocery code of conduct that has been established in the UK and even in other parts of Europe. And the grocery code of conduct literally prevents and works to prevent price gouging in the middle. And it's a mechanism that we need to further explore and use, but it can't be just there as a one-stop measure. It's just one piece of the puzzle. We also have to celebrate creative and innovation that's happening right here in our riding to get our price of food stabilized. You know, for instance, if all of our local farmers and entrepreneurs in our area had the right policy and the political will to have the right support, we could be so much further ahead. Right here in Huntsville, there is a farm that is growing food year round with fertilizing from, believe it or not, from an aquaponic tank. So we're taking tilapia fish that are feeding water through to fertilize vegetables. And in place, we have right here in Huntsville, a place that can grow vegetables year round and is raising fish year round. Just north of us in Almaguin, while I met with some farmers, they're developing a warehouse in Almaguin that is going to grow 6,500 vegetable plants consistently through the year using vertical towers. And they've already have contracts with grocery stores from North Bay to Aurelia. These are just a couple of the ideas that are already in play, but we need to leverage them. We need to expand on them. We need good government policy that gets behind small business, not big business, the way the Conservative government has been doing. We also must realize that people need, to get their cost of living down, they need a way to afford to live in the homes they live in or the apartments they live in, the condos they live in. We need to ensure that their cost of heating and cooling is more in line with what we can all afford. And that's why we are proposing the most ambitious green retrofit program so that we can save on energy and obviously save on money too. And the bonus here is that it also helps us crush climate pollution. And lastly, to ensure that our most vulnerable are being supported, we must absolutely must be a fierce champion of doubling ODSP payments. Ontario Disability Support Program payments are not even close to honoring their the cost of living that people who require those payments. So we have committed to doubling ODSP payments. But you know what? Here's how we're going to do it. And this is what separates us from the other three parties. We're not going to give false promises or gimmicks. We're not going to do a license plate sticker rebate. We were the only party to vote against that license plate sticker rebate, which took $1 billion that the government was currently collecting and handed it back to the people. But the people who were receiving that license plate sticker rebate, many did not really require it, to the same point as our most vulnerable. Some of our most vulnerable people and those living below poverty, they don't own a vehicle. So they saw nothing on that rebate program. We had $1 billion that we just magically said, or not we, that the Conservatives said, we can hand back? No, thank you. On behalf of people of Parry Sound-Muskoka, we could put that money towards so many things, like starting to work towards doubling our ODSP payments. So we have a pretty comprehensive plan as to an approach, and this is, of all these different pieces of the puzzle, one real thought through process to get our cost of living down.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Next up, what will you do to encourage responsible development that meets the environmental and economic needs of Parry Sound-Muskoka communities?
Great question. And, when economy and environment are seen as going hand in hand, I think we've all moved forward. When I started out in 2007, the first time, people like to separate the environment and the economy. They go hand in hand. And now, after years of building a strong message and awareness, I think all the people in our riding who always believe that are seeing that the majority understand that now. Like, we live here because we appreciate, a quality of life that includes a healthy environment. We must protect our water. We must protect nature, and we need an ambitious and real climate action plan to do so. And that's what we've put forward. You can't have a vibrant tourism sector if we don't have a sustainable and prosperous and just very healthy environment. Those go hand in hand, and we must recognize that. And at the same time, I can also appreciate that as a small business owner myself, to ensure that we have a strong economy and strong environment, we must look at what the number one issue that's preventing businesses from really thriving right now in our riding, that we look at this number one issue, which is the lack of affordable housing. And why is it such? Because the lack of affordable housing is leading to a work shortage up here. I've heard from a worker shortage, employee shortage. I've heard from so many employers up here and business owners and sole proprietors that want to expand and grow their business, that they can't find the staff. Well, that requires housing. But we can't just do housing which keeps sprawling and cutting down the perimeter and advancing our neighborhoods. We must address the concerns that we see throughout, that there are better ways of building affordable housing that doesn't involve clear-cutting land, that doesn't involve prioritizing developers. We must incentivize a better way forward so that affordable housing is affordable to live in, it's energy efficient, it's built in a way that our communities, that people can live in the community and work in the community and cut down on commute times, because commuting is a pretty significant issue up here. So we must be looking at the lens of economy and environment, also through housing as well. And that's where we've really pushed forward this ambitious program to get on with building affordable apartment rental units and making sure that those units offer the purpose of getting people into a place that they can call home, which also involves working here in the place to ease off on this worker shortage. And so I think that's one of the number one key pieces that separates, again, us from especially the conservatives, that we're saying we need to fund this as our priority, not, if, for instance, not a massive new highway down in through the Holland Marsh and going north of the 407 to a tune of $8 to $10 billion. The other government wants to spend shamefully $8 to $10 billion on a highway we don't need. We could be using some of that money to be building the affordable housing that we so desperately require, so that people can afford to live and work up here. And I see that as being a real key piece of the puzzle to ensure that we can have a strong environment and a strong economy hand in hand.
Okay, Matt. So I heard from Climate Action Muskoka when they saw our questions, and they said, this does not adequately address how important the climate issue is to the voters in Parry Sound-Muskoka. So they asked me to ask a follow-up question, which is, the highest contributor by far to greenhouse gas emissions in Parry Sound-Muskoka is the transportation sector. How will you ensure that these emissions drop dramatically as demanded by the urgency of the climate crisis?
Yeah, we must get our transportation emissions down. And that's why when we put forward a plan, we're not going to deliver the conservatives' false promises or mediocre half measures of promising just a plan or partial funding for some, and I emphasize some of the solutions, specifically when it comes to getting us to a way that we can lower our carbon emissions for transportation. First of all, the Northlander. The Northlander must be prioritized. It's been over 10 years of not having reliable passenger rail for the people on the Almaguin and Muskoka side of our riding to literally travel from our area down to Toronto and back and forth. It has to be prioritized, but it can't be by just throwing a little bit of money at it. We need to properly invest. Not 75 million, the actual figure is $250 million plus, because we can't go back to having the same old system of the Northlander, which wasn't reliable, it wasn't efficient. So we must make honest investments in things we need, like a Northlander, going back to not a new highway, or what I should call sprawlway that's going to go through the Holland Marsh. But we also recognize that we need better options that connect our communities in our riding. And that's why we're going to propose funding and fight for funding to make sure our communities have interconnected city buses, or you call it riding buses, and that those different agencies and organizations that are providing transportation that can connect are properly funded to do so. We need to live in more livable, connected cities, towns, communities, and that is so true here in our riding. And lastly, how many people wouldn't like to cut back on their gas bill and really reduce their carbon emissions by owning an electric vehicle? I know most would say, sure, like absolutely. But unfortunately, people can't afford it. And that's just shameful. It's disgraceful when other places in Canada are offering realistic incentives to get people into EVs. We must go back to offering realistic, real achievable targets for getting people into electric vehicles. And in our platform, we have been calling for this for a while, but we put it right there to call for a $10,000 rebate on any electric vehicle, but also, like Quebec, a $1,000 rebate on an electric vehicle that is used, and also looking at e-bikes too for in towns of our communities. So that's part one, or that's a piece of the puzzle with electric vehicle. The other is making sure that the correct infrastructure is put in place. So for charging, that is actually encouraged and followed through on with the right funding and support throughout Ontario. So everything from the Northlander to interconnected buses through our communities here in our riding of Parry Sound-Muskoka, and access to electric vehicles, that's the way we're going to get it done. And that's been front and center in our climate plan.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So you spoke a bit about housing. Our question is, what would you do to alleviate the housing crisis in Parry Sound-Muskoka? Do you have something to add to that?
I really am excited too. Yes, and we've made a recent announcement. I believe Mike Schreiner, the Ontario Green Party leader, made this announcement today about a specific target of 100,000 affordable apartment rental units and 60,000 supportive units with wraparound mental health services built in. And it's so important that the government takes a role in building, in recognizing that they're responsible for the building. And how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to do it by partnering with nonprofits and co-ops. You know, right in Parry Sound, there's the Georgian Bay Native nonprofit, and I like to use this as an example that needs to be replicated. They took the former William Beatty Public School and converted it into 40 apartment rental units in the building itself, the former school. They kept the gym to be a community gym. They've also included a non-denominational church. They have an early years center and a daycare center. Now, everyone think about that. Like, that's a great need that's being served by a nonprofit right in Parry Sound. Let's make sure that this actually can be replicated so that our towns and communities throughout our riding can actually replicate this and get on with it. And here's the best part. The apartment rental units are at $850 per month. You know, and that just shows a stark contrast as to the other side, the shameful side, as to how high rents have risen. There are people here in our riding that are paying over $1,500 a month for a 1-bedroom apartment. Shocking, but the solutions are there. It just needs the good political will to get on with it. The other political aspect that we want to bring good public policy towards is that ensuring our towns have the right for the land, for people who are owning a home to change it to a triplex or a fourplex, if they will, to ensure that towns can get ahead and build tiny homes if they want, that we have other creative solutions, that homes can add on a granny suite, that we can build up the missing middle and have laneway homes. And for our seniors, we must look at co-housing as typical and allowable. Unfortunately, there are communities in our riding that have banned co-housing for seniors, even though it's the shining example as to how to do things. When we look at Denmark, for instance, co-housing is the standard as people get older. And so we have all these different facets as to how we can really achieve affordable housing in our area. And this is one key election to actually get on with it.
Thank you, Matt. So we have a question from a reader, David Tom of Torrance, and he says that summer weekend traffic on overburdened highways 11 and 400 is as predictable as a lovely Muskoka sunset. If elected, would you work to have the provincial transit agency Metrolinx study a seasonal weekend extension of GO Transit up the Richmond Hill line to Gravenhurst, Bracebridge, and Huntsville?
David, every option is on the board, absolutely, and how that may complement or expand upon what we're calling for is part of how we do politics. It's about bringing people with the solutions and the ideas into the mix, and then ensuring that that's how we move forward when it comes to moving people from the city up to Muskoka for all those tourism related reasons. But this is why it's so important to properly fund the Northlander and make sure that that funding is there. Specifically to your question, I would need a bit more information as to how this is slightly different or what that full extent is. But I know we have the full commitment to ensure that we prioritize transit, in this case, passenger rail, that is bringing us from our riding down to Union Station in Toronto and back and forth with consistent stops. You know, I was down in Toronto earlier when I was saying about presenting the mental health paper. I drove down to Allendale Station in Barrie, and that's where I got on the GO station to get down to Toronto. It was great when I got to Allendale, but the inconvenience of having to drive, find the parking there, it was unnecessary. We live in Ontario. We live in arguably what should be one of the greatest spots on earth. And every phenomenal country realizes, and every jurisdiction in the world and region realizes that a robust and a dynamic transportation system is part and parcel of being a great place to live. So we got to get on with it. But I would always entertain hearing more specifics to your specific example, David. But we are, like, let it be heard loud and clear, we are 100% pushing for the return of the Northlander, and not any more false promises or half measures. We don't want to go back to the 2012 version of the Northlander. We want to go back to real passenger rail that offers reliable service and affordable service.
Okay, thank you. So another reader, Heidi from Parry Sound, reached out, and she said that her mother recently applied and received her dental card for seniors. She thinks it's great for those in low-income situations, which is many of our seniors. The problem is she can't use it. We tried registering her dental card with the Parry Sound Health Unit and have been told that there are no dentists that can accept this card. She would have to drive 2 hours north to North Bay. She doesn't have a car. She's 84 years old. She can't drive. She doesn't understand why a benefit like this exists if it can't be used. Do you have a plan for dental care?
Yeah, well, absolutely. For dental care, and for dental care, that is healthcare, and we must be, just like in past elections too, be calling for coverage of dental health. And unfortunately, this scenario that was just shared, and unfortunately, this has been an ongoing concern from not just the last election till now, but every election that I've run in since 2007. So the same old isn't getting the job done. We must look at ways and realistic ways of ensuring that those who need dental coverage are getting it, and those who need dental care are getting it, of course. Now, this does involve ensuring that we're not duplicating what the federal government has already promised. So we must be mindful that the recent announcement from the federal government, we have to go down to Queen's Park and ensure that the funding geared towards dental care actually goes that way. And unfortunately, the Conservative government has often received money that's supposed to go to one area of need, and they've used it for others. And we never see where that money's gone. So I would like to be open, transparent, give updates as to how the federal money from that promise of offering dental care is where it's at and how you access it. And that's why a good politician at their office and giving feedback, we work hand in hand to ensure that you're getting the dental care you need. And I've heard it time and time again too from our hospitals and our emergency rooms that we must fund and we must show more respect to the need of having dental care covered, because the number of people, well, for a variety of reasons, but from the emergency room perspective, the number of people who are showing up at our ERs, at our hospitals in Parry Sound and here in Huntsville and Bracebridge because of dental, the cause is dental, is avoidable. And it's shameful, again, that the government hasn't acted on this and recognized that by offering dental care, it's good for the patient and it's good for the whole healthcare system in general. So 100%, we're going to work towards getting people understanding how, and not just understanding, but actually getting them in to get the dental work that they so rightly deserve.
Thank you. So with just about 6 minutes left, I want to give folks who are with us today the opportunity to ask a question. Tom Doswell, I think I saw your hand up earlier. Did you have a question for Matt?
Yes, I do, Matt. And Pamela, good to hear from you. I talked to you on phone personally from Parry Sound. Just going to bounce this one out to Matt. He's familiar, and so is Pamela, a little bit with the fact that we have stucco falling in my apartment building, coming down off the ceiling with witnesses from the town office and fire department, and the possibility of being toxic. Nothing being done because of the Ford government has no protocols in place. So what the doctor, no protocols in place to get me out of here. Went to get some help with cognitive issues around the toxicity. They can't do nothing because there's no protocols put in by Doug Ford. We talk about people being clawed back. You just talk about the money that's going for affordability. If I make money, they take 30% of my income off of my DSAB unit. And I work for $2.25 an hour, by the way, for a broadcaster out of Huntsville. And I now am on a system that I have to rely on the government and tenants. It's not right that we have to work with people who are paying poverty wages. We never address that. You talk about raising it, you talk about helping businesses, but I think businesses should be able to be forced to pay more in some instances. Pamela, call me about this story. Let's get it active because it needs to stop. Go ahead.
Okay, so your question then for Matt is would his party do something about?
Yeah, I think I got the gist of it. And Tom, thank you for your question. There's a lot there to unpack, but everything from specifics to affordable housing and the places that we all live in, the health of our homes and our apartments must be supported, and government plays a massive role in ensuring that that where people live, that especially when it's publicly funded, that those living conditions are not causing people to have health concerns. In your case, Tom, you mentioned stucco falling in and causing eye issues. So this is again a problem that there is so many times that protocols are put in place, bylaws are put in place, but they're not appropriately funded or looked after because the provincial government isn't appropriately funding the rules and legislation to be enforced. And like, of course, you should not be living in an apartment where stucco is falling down. That's just, it's disrespectful and it's unnecessary. But it needs people being funded by the government, whether they be at whatever level, to ensure that your house and your living conditions are not toxic. And I don't know if you mentioned as well with mold, but like all of these situations need to be avoided, but it needs to be appropriately funded. When it comes to clawback and with your Ontario Disability Support Program payments not being clear enough, we are completely opposed to the clawback, and we are in fact being proactive, as I said earlier, to double ODSP payments. But even going a step further, we must entertain the conversation of a basic income guarantee. That is it should be a human right. We live in Ontario 2022, everyone. We should not be living in a place where we have to still be living in communities where people live below poverty. Consider that. Consider the pride that so many of us share about where we live, and that we are proud to live in Ontario, proud to be Canadian, and yet we have people living in poverty. That can't go hand in hand, but it has been over all these past election cycles. So, Tom, absolutely, we're committed to ensuring that people rise out of poverty and have the dignity of life, and especially not having to live with falling stucco, as your specific example was brought up.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Now we're at about 43 minutes now. Do you have time if there's any other questions from the folks on the call?
Absolutely.
You do? Okay.
Oh, sure.
Please raise your hand, folks, if somebody else has a question. Any other questions? Okay. Not seeing other hands up. My final question for you, Matt, is what is the most important issue this election?
In this upcoming election, the most important issue is trust. And I say that because this is what I'm hearing from people across our riding, and it's what I've heard in the past as well. This is the election that trust is so important to build and develop between people and politics. It has to be a way to shape our way forward to achieve the future that we want, that we know we are working hand in hand together. And when it comes to any of our issues, whether it be around healthcare, whether it be towards our affordable housing crisis, or where we're moving into our action to tackle the climate crisis, that we know we are working forward on a plan that involves evidence, that is based on best practice, and that people understand the rationale for the decisions being made, and that is openly communicated in a timely and transparent fashion. Every time that we listen to people at the doorstep, or when we're making phone calls, when we're putting different events on in town halls on Zoom, we've heard this time and time again, that a better way of doing politics involves trust. And that has to be the cornerstone of moving forward on all the other issues that we all face. We live in such a vast riding, a diverse riding, that the one thing that does unite us is a better way of doing politics. And as we move forward, the appetite for change in this election is massive. And when we can say that this time we can actually change things around, we are on this area of growth in our riding when it comes to politics, that we can just jump forward and turn this riding green and have a way of doing politics that puts people ahead of party, that builds trust, not mistrust. It is absolutely critical that we all really value and exercise our right to vote for a change and put that area in need that is fundamentally the number one issue for all of us. How are we going to build into a future that we all want, and a future that we can be proud that we're leaving for future generations? Over this past few years of building up to this election, I can proudly say that in our riding, we're already in a strong second. We're on a position that's going to build into a way of doing politics that can send a strong message to the rest of Ontario that our riding's ready for change, and we're ready to turn this riding green. It's possible and it's doable if we all really exercise and stand up for what we believe in. And that's the better way forward, that starts with changing how politics is done, that really, really focuses on the trust that we so need. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Next week, May 12th, we're hoping to talk with a Liberal candidate, but the Liberals have yet to table one. So if there is one, we will be here talking to them. May 19th is Doug Maynard with the New Blue Party. May 24th, we speak with Graydon Smith, the Conservative candidate, which is not a Thursday, it's a Tuesday. And Aaron Horvath of the NDPs is with us on May 26th. And then there we are. It's election day on June 2nd. So thank you for joining us. We hope to see you next week. Thank you again, Matt.
And thank you, Pamela. And if I could give just a shout out to keeping the dialogue going, next Tuesday night is the Northern Ontario Leaders Debate in North Bay. And I believe all 4 leaders from the 4 major parties will be there.
Thank you, Matt. Goodbye.
All right, thank you.